It only took 8 seconds for my life to turn upside down. 1 minute I was sipping my coffee on the porch, admiring the calmness of the morning, and the next, the ground shook, and the old wooden bridge that connected my ranch to the rest of the world crumbled into splinters with a roar. At the far side of the wreckage, standing tall with a neon clipboard and a smug grin, was none other than Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, acting like she had just won a prize at the county fair. For a few heartbeats, I thought maybe it was some kind of bizarre accident. Then Karen raised her bullhorn and announced to the silent countryside that the bridge was a safety hazard and had been removed for the good of the community. I nearly choked on my coffee. My bridge, the one built by my grandfather, the only way in or out of my ranch, was now nothing more than floating debris in the creek below. And Karen was celebrating like she had just liberated a country. I dropped my mug so hard it shattered on the porch. I rushed down the hill toward the bridge, heart pounding, mud splashing up my boots. By the time I reached the wreckage, a small crowd had gathered behind Karen, all of them clapping politely as if this was some sort of heroic act. There was even a homemade banner flapping in the breeze that read, Community Improvement Day. Karen held up a paper that she claimed was an HOA mandate for the demolition. I asked her how she got permission to demolish property that was not even under HOA jurisdiction. She just sneered and said that since the bridge led to the town road, it was a public safety issue and the HOA had voted to act. I could hardly believe the audacity. She stood there acting like she was saving lives while I stood on the edge of my property, cut off from the world with no way to move supplies, livestock, or even leave if there was an emergency. The anger boiled inside me, but I kept my face calm. This was not the time to explode. I knew how people like Karen operated. They thrived on reactions, on drama, on scenes they could twist to fit their narrative. Instead, I asked her plainly if she realized what she had done. Karen, in that syrupy, condescending tone only she could master, said she had done me a favor. She said the bridge was an eyesore and a lawsuit waiting to happen. Now, thanks to her leadership, the community would be safer and prettier. Then she winked at me, actually winked. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. Behind Karen, her posse of HOA board members stood nodding like bobbleheads. A few of the younger ones looked less confident, glancing nervously at the wreckage, maybe realizing too late that something about this did not feel right. One man, Jackson, whispered something to Karen, and she brushed him off with a wave of her clipboard. She turned back to me and, without a hint of irony, suggested that if I wanted access restored, I could apply for a permit through the HOA and rebuild the bridge according to their new aesthetic standard. She even had the nerve to mention that the new design must include decorative lanterns, a white-painted railing, and of course an HOA-approved color palette. I stood there for a long moment, staring at her, pretending to think it over. Then I smiled, not a fake smile, not a polite smile, but the kind of smile you give when you are holding the winning hand and the other player has no idea they are about to lose everything. I thanked Karen for her concern and assured her I would consider her suggestion carefully. Karen beamed, thinking she had won, and turned to bask in the admiration of her little crowd as they packed up their folding chairs and banners, leaving behind a mess of broken wood and muddy tire tracks. I turned and walked slowly back up the hill to my house. I paused halfway to glance back at the ruined bridge. Karen was laughing about something with her friends, probably imagining how proud the HOA newsletter would be with her picture on the cover. What she did not know, what nobody there knew, was that the bridge, the road leading up to it, and the land surrounding it all the way to the main road was not public land. It was private property. My property, bought years ago in a quiet deal when the original developer went bust and liquidated assets. I owned the bridge. I owned the access road. I owned the easements. Karen had not demolished public property. She had demolished my property. And she had done it without permission, without permits, without a single legal leg to stand on. I made it back to my porch, stepping over the broken coffee mug, and sat down in my rocking chair. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the empty field. I rocked slowly, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, letting the sweet satisfaction of what was about to unfold wash over me. Karen thought she had isolated me. She thought she had boxed me in and bent me to the will of her petty little HOA rules. She had no idea she had just detonated a powder keg under her own feet. The coming days were going to be very interesting. I had no intention of rebuilding that bridge. In fact, I had plans to make sure no one from the HOA ever used my road again. They would learn that when you pick a fight with a quiet rancher, you better make sure you know what you are doing. Because out here, land is not just dirt and trees. It is power. And Karen had just handed me all the power I needed. The laughter of Karen and her crew floated faintly across the field as they packed up their things, oblivious to the storm they had unleashed. I tipped my hat to no one in particular and smiled again. Let them have their moment. Their reckoning was coming, and it would be far sweeter than any revenge they could have ever imagined. Years ago, when I first bought the ranch, it was a struggling piece of land tucked away at the edge of town, barely more than a forgotten plot on a half-paved road. The old man who sold it to me, Elijah, was desperate, trying to get out from under a mountain of debts after a failed development project. During the deal, he offered me a strange little bonus. For a few thousand extra, I could have full rights to the private access road and the wooden bridge that spanned the lazy creek separating the ranch from the highway. It sounded odd at the time, but something about it seemed wise. My father always said, "Control your roads and you control your future." I signed the papers and tucked them away, never imagining they would become my greatest weapon one day. When Karen marched onto my property with her demolition crew and that ridiculous clipboard, she had no idea she was walking into a legal minefield. She thought she was dealing with a simple rancher, someone she could intimidate with fake notices and empty threats. But I was not about to let some power-hungry HOA tyrant bulldoze my life without consequences. First, I needed to make sure everything was in order. It had been a few years since I last looked at those documents. Early the next morning, before the sun had even fully cleared the hills, I drove my old pickup into town and parked in front of the county deeds office. Inside, the building smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. The clerk behind the counter was a wiry old man named Wilbur, with glasses perched halfway down his nose. I gave him my name, my property details, and the request to pull every deed, easement, and right-of-way connected to my land and the access road. It took him a while to find everything, shuffling through yellowed files and muttering to himself. Finally, he laid a thick stack of papers on the counter between us. There it was, in black and white, my name on the deed for the road, the bridge, and the land surrounding it all the way to the highway. Full ownership, full legal control, no HOA jurisdiction, no public right-of-way. The bridge was a private structure on private land. Karen had as much authority over it as she did over the moon. I left the office with a certified copy of the paperwork tucked safely under my arm and a growing sense of satisfaction in my chest. The next step was setting the stage. Karen was arrogant, but she was not completely stupid. If she realized too soon how badly she had messed up, she might try to cover her tracks or spin the story to her advantage. I needed her to believe she had won, just a little longer. So I returned home and got to work. First, I fenced off the remains of the bridge with sturdy metal panels and posted a few signs reading, "No trespassing," "Private property," "Violators will be prosecuted." Simple, clear, and fully within my right. The sight of the signs alone would be enough to start rumors among the HOA boozabodies. Later that afternoon, as I was hammering the last sign into place, I saw Karen drive by in her shiny white SUV, the same one she always parked diagonally across two spaces at the community center. She slowed down, rolled her window halfway down, and shouted across the creek that I was making things worse for myself. I just tipped my hat and went back to hammering, ignoring her completely. That seemed to infuriate her more than any words could have. She revved the engine and sped off in a cloud of dust. Over the next few days, the situation began to unfold exactly as I had predicted. The HOA sent me an official letter filled with fancy words and fake legal threats, demanding that I rebuild the bridge immediately under their supervision and at my own expense. They included a list of new aesthetic requirements, complete with sketches of decorative lampposts, pastel color schemes, and even a little gazebo area for pedestrians. It would have been hilarious if it were not so insulting. They had demolished my bridge without permission and now expected me to pay to rebuild it their way, just to satisfy Karen's petty vanity. I filed the letter away without responding. Let them think I was panicking. Let them believe I was boxed in. The truth was, without that bridge, I could still get supplies delivered through a back trail that only I knew about. A rough dirt path through the woods that was good enough for my truck and horses. The HOA, however, had no other route. The access road that crossed my land and bridge was the only way in or out for their little planned community of cookie-cutter houses. Without it, they would soon find themselves trapped, isolated, and very, very desperate. As I continued my daily work on the ranch, repairing fences, tending animals, and preparing for the upcoming season, I could feel the tension building across the creek. Karen and her board members began hosting emergency meetings. They put up new signs at the subdivision entrance promising residents that the bridge situation was temporary and that improvements were underway. But as the days dragged into weeks and no construction crews appeared, residents started getting nervous. The HOA newsletter grew increasingly defensive, blaming delays on mysterious county regulations and vague contractor issues. Meanwhile, I made a few quiet phone calls to the county offices, alerting them to the unauthorized demolition on private property. I knew it would take time, but eventually, the fines and legal inquiries would start rolling in. Karen had set off a chain reaction she could not control, and the best part was, I never had to lift a finger in anger. All I had to do was sit back, watch, and wait. By the end of the third week, I noticed something strange. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold across the fields, I spotted a group of HOA board members walking down the blocked road, flashlights bobbing in the twilight. They stood at the edge of the ruined bridge, peering across the creek, whispering among themselves. One of them, Victoria, even waved at me, a timid, awkward gesture that I chose to ignore. They looked like lost children who had broken a toy and were now trying to figure out how to fix it without getting scolded. I sat on my porch, rocking gently in my chair, sipping a glass of iced tea. The ranch was quiet, peaceful, exactly the way I liked it. Karen and her cronies were learning the hard way that land ownership was not a game, and that real power did not come from shouting or waving clipboards. It came from patience, planning, and knowing when to strike. Their time was running out, and soon they would come crawling. I smiled into the sunset and waited. The day of the spring festival arrived, and with it came a spectacle that was almost too good to be true. Karen, in all her misguided glory, had decided that the HOA would hold its grand annual parade and celebration, using the same access road they no longer legally controlled. Brightly colored balloons floated above makeshift booths, children carried homemade banners, and golf carts, decorated like parade floats, lined up along the street leading toward the broken bridge. Music blared from portable speakers, and the air was thick with the smell of grilled hot dogs and cotton candy. It would have been charming if it were not built entirely on a foundation of arrogance and ignorance. From my porch, I watched the preparations with quiet amusement, sipping my coffee as the first golf cart, decked out in streamers and fake flowers, made its way down the road, leading the parade toward the barricaded end. The closer they got to the entrance of my property, the slower the carts moved. Parents frowned. Children pointed. At first, it was confusion, then frustration, then anger as the crowd realized that a heavy-duty steel gate now blocked the access road. Thick concrete barriers stood on either side, anchored deep into the ground. Bright red signs hung from the gate reading, "Private property. No access. Authorized personnel only. Violators will be prosecuted." There was no way around it. The parade came to an awkward, sputtering halt. Karen, wearing a sash that read Grand Marshal and holding a gold-tipped baton, stormed forward to the front of the group. Her face turned a shade of crimson I had only seen once before, when the local feed store accidentally double-charged her for a bag of mulch. She marched right up to the gate and shook it furiously, rattling the chain and padlock. When that accomplished nothing, she turned and shouted at the crowd to stay calm, that this was just a minor setback, and that she would personally handle it. I leaned back in my rocking chair, savoring every second. Karen pulled out her phone and began furiously dialing numbers, pacing in tight little circles near the barrier. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared in the distance. The sheriff had arrived. The sheriff, an easygoing man named Marcus who had known me since we were kids, stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene with the weary patience of someone used to dealing with small-town dramas. Karen practically sprinted to him, waving her arms wildly and shouting about vandalism and illegal blockades. She demanded that he arrest me immediately for obstruction and endangerment. Sheriff Marcus listened politely, nodded a few times, and then asked her to show him the property deeds proving HOA jurisdiction over the road and bridge. Karen faltered. She blustered. She fumbled through a stack of papers she had brought, most of which were nothing more than HOA meeting notes and violation notices that held no legal weight. Marcus patiently flicked through them, then shook his head and handed them back. He walked over to the gate, examined the locks, the barriers, the signs, then turned around and called me over with a wave. I strolled down from the porch, paperwork in hand, and met him halfway. Without saying a word, I handed him the certified deeds and easement documents. He took his time reading them, nodding slowly as understanding dawned on his face. Turning back to the crowd, Sheriff Marcus raised his voice and announced that the road, the bridge, and the land surrounding them were indeed private property owned exclusively by me, and that I had every legal right to restrict access. The HOA had no claim, no authority, and no right to demand anything. Karen tried to interrupt, but Marcus held up a hand to silence her. Furthermore, he said, any further attempts to trespass or remove the barriers would result in immediate legal action. The silence that followed was one of the most beautiful sounds I had ever heard. Parents pulled their kids back from the barriers. Volunteers dismantled booths hastily. The golf carts did awkward three-point turns to retreat up the road. Karen stood alone at the gate, fuming, her face a mask of rage and humiliation. Her grand parade, her moment of glory, had turned into a public disaster. As the crowd dispersed, I caught snippets of conversations. Residents grumbled about the HOA leadership. Some muttered about moving away. Others demanded to know why they had been missiled. Karen retreated to her SUV, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, and sped off without a word. The rest of the day passed in blissful quiet. I spent the afternoon repairing a section of fence that had been knocked over by a stubborn bull, feeling lighter than I had in months. That evening, as the sun set and the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, my phone buzzed with a message from a friend in town, Drake. He had attached a video that was already making the rounds on local social media. It showed Karen at the blocked gate, screaming at the sheriff, shaking the padlock, demanding justice, and being firmly corrected in front of dozens of witnesses. The comments were merciless. People who had once blindly supported her were now mocking her openly. Memes popped up with Karen's face superimposed on medieval paintings of defeated monarchs. The power Karen thought she held was crumbling faster than the bridge she had demolished. She had spent so long pretending to be untouchable, so long issuing fines and threats and hosting meetings filled with empty speeches, that she had forgotten the simple truth of small-town life. Word traveled fast, reputations could be shattered in a single afternoon, and now her reign of petty tyranny was coming to an end, not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding loss of respect from the very people she thought she ruled. I went to bed that night feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The wheels were turning, the trap was set, and Karen had walked right into it without even realizing. But this was only the beginning. There were still more lessons for her to learn, harder ones that would leave no doubt in her mind that some battles were never meant to be picked. Tomorrow would bring a new round of consequences, and I was ready for every single one of them. The next morning, the air was thick with the feeling that something was brewing. Even the animals seemed restless, the horses snorting and shifting uneasily in their stalls, and the chickens fussing louder than usual. I saddled up and took a slow ride along the edge of my property, my eyes sharp for anything unusual. It did not take long to find it. Down by the ruined bridge, there was fresh activity. Trucks I did not recognize were parked on the far side of the creek. Men in hard hats and reflective vests were unloading lumber, concrete forms, and heavy equipment. A makeshift construction site had sprung up overnight, and at the center of it all was Karen, barking orders like a general preparing for battle. I watched from the tree line, unseen, my anger growing cold and sharp rather than hot and reckless. Karen had not learned a thing. In fact, she had doubled down. Instead of accepting defeat, she had hired contractors to start building a new bridge right across my private land, without so much as an apology or a permit. It was not just audacious, it was criminal, and it was about to backfire on her in ways she clearly could not imagine. Slipping back to the house, I made a few quick phone calls, first to the county zoning office, then to the Environmental Protection Agency, and finally to a local drone operator who owed me a few favors. Within a few hours, I had everything lined up. The drone would capture aerial footage of the illegal construction, showing clear trespass onto my property. The county would send out an inspector to verify the violations, and the EPA, once notified, would have no choice but to investigate the dumping of construction debris into the creek, which could easily trigger federal penalties. By late afternoon, the drone operator, Lamb, arrived. We set up on a ridge overlooking the site. The drone buzzed to life and lifted into the sky, its small camera capturing every inch of the unauthorized bridge work in stunning detail. Workers moved back and forth across the creek bed, hammering posts into the ground, dumping bags of concrete, and installing temporary supports. Karen stood near a folding table littered with blueprints, occasionally jabbing a finger at the papers and shouting instructions. She looked proud, defiant, and utterly oblivious to the trap she was walking deeper into by the minute. Satisfied that we had all the evidence needed, I thanked the drone operator and sent copies of the footage to the appropriate offices. Then I leaned back against the fence and watched the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson, feeling a deep, unshakable calm settle over me. I did not need to lift a single hand against Karen. The law would do it for me. 2 days later, the inspectors arrived, county officials in starched shirts with clipboards, environmental agents in green jackets, even a state water resources officer in mirrored sunglasses. They descended on the construction site like a pack of wolves, surrounding the workers, asking questions, snapping pictures, taking measurements. Karen tried to put on her best air of authority, waving her HOA badge and insisting everything was perfectly legal, but it was clear from the faces of the officials that they were not buying a word of it. One of the inspectors, a short woman with a steely gaze named Dr. Rivera, pointed out the boundary markers I had carefully maintained over the years, bright orange posts driven deep into the ground, clearly marking the edge of my land. The new bridge supports were well inside those boundaries. Karen's contractors, who had obviously assumed everything was above board, started packing up their tools as soon as they realized they had been lied to. By the end of the day, Karen was served with multiple citations: unauthorized construction on private property, environmental damage to a protected creek, violation of zoning ordinances. Each citation carried hefty fines, some in the tens of thousands of dollars. Karen's face, already pale with fury, went completely blank as the numbers were read out. She tried to argue, but the inspectors ignored her. The law was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the consequences inevitable. Word spread like wildfire through the community. Social media lit up with photos of the inspectors at the site, videos of Karen arguing with officials, memes mocking her attempt to build a bridge without permission. Residents who had once supported her began to question her leadership openly. Emergency meetings were called. Petitions circulated. Demands for her resignation grew louder with each passing hour. Meanwhile, I continued my daily life on the ranch, untouched by the chaos swirling across the creek. I repaired fences, tended the animals, and prepared the fields for planting. The peaceful rhythm of ranch life was sweeter than ever, each task made lighter by the knowledge that justice was unfolding exactly as it should. A few days later, I received an unexpected visitor. It was one of the HOA board members, Oliver, a middle-aged man with a defeated look in his eyes and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the access road, hat in hand, and asked if we could talk. I invited him up to the porch, offered him a glass of lemonade, and listened as he explained the situation. The board had voted to remove Karen from her leadership position. The fines were too severe, the public humiliation too great, and the trust too thoroughly shattered. Now they were in damage control mode, desperate to find a way to restore access to the subdivision without further legal battles or financial ruin. They wanted to negotiate. They needed my permission to rebuild the bridge, properly this time, with full respect for my property rights and terms. I sipped my lemonade and let him talk, watching the sweat bead on his forehead as he stumbled through apologies and pleas. When he finally finished, I set my glass down carefully on the armrest and leaned forward. I told him I would consider allowing the construction of a new bridge, but only if the HOA agreed to my conditions. They would pay for all construction costs, including environmental remediation. They would publicly acknowledge that the road and bridge were private property and had never been under HOA control. They would include a clause in their bylaws permanently recognizing my property rights, preventing any future challenges. And most importantly, Karen would have to issue a public apology, standing in front of the entire community, admitting her wrongdoing. Oliver paled further but nodded slowly, realizing they had no choice. He promised to bring my terms to the board and get back to me within the week. As he left, I leaned back in my rocking chair, the evening breeze cool against my skin, and smiled to myself. Karen had demolished a bridge thinking she was destroying a problem. Instead, she had built a monument to her own downfall, plank by plank, and now she would have to walk across it in shame for everyone to see. The days that followed were some of the most satisfying I had ever experienced. Word got around fast that the HOA board had accepted my terms. I did not hear it from them directly at first, but from the whispers in the town diner, the murmurs at the hardware store, and the knowing nods of the old-timers who had seen it all before. The board was desperate to put the whole disaster behind them, and Karen, once the untouchable queen bee, was now the face of every joke in town. But there was one condition still hanging in the air like a thundercloud about to burst: the apology. It was not just a formality. It was the final act, the closing chapter, the moment that would seal the lesson so deeply that neither Karen nor anyone else would ever dare cross that line again. A formal announcement was made. There would be a community meeting at the subdivision's little park, the same place where Karen had once strutted across the gazebo stage, handing out fake awards for the greenest lawn or the straightest fence. This time, the crowd would not be gathering to cheer her. They would be there to watch her fall. I arrived early, taking a seat at the edge of the park under the old oak tree, leaning back casually while residents trickled in. Some came out of pure curiosity, others out of a need for closure, and a few, I suspected, simply for the sheer pleasure of seeing karma do its work. The turnout was larger than I expected. Families with lawn chairs, teenagers with their phones ready to record, older couples whispering to each other with gleaming eyes. The new HOA president, a mild-mannered woman named Sophia, stepped onto the gazebo stage and tapped the microphone nervously. She cleared her throat and made a brief speech about accountability, community trust, and the need to move forward. Then, with a deep breath, she announced Karen. There was no applause, only a heavy, expectant silence as Karen emerged from behind the gazebo. She looked nothing like the woman who had stood so triumphantly at the wrecked bridge weeks earlier. Gone was the crisp suit and smug smile. Instead, she wore a plain blouse and slacks, her shoulders hunched, her face pale and drawn. She clutched a piece of paper in her trembling hands, the wind threatening to rip it from her grasp. For a long moment, she stood there frozen, staring out at the sea of faces, many of which she had once ruled with fear and petty fines. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that Sophia had to motion for her to speak up. Karen took a shaky breath and began reading from the paper. She admitted that she had acted without authority, that she had overstepped her bounds, that she had demolished private property without permission. She apologized to the community for the embarrassment, the financial penalties, and the disruption she had caused. She apologized to me by name, acknowledging that I had every right to protect my land and that the HOA had never had any jurisdiction over the bridge or road. There was no applause at the end of her speech, only the rustle of paper and a few uncomfortable coughs. Karen lowered her head and left the stage without looking up. The moment was not theatrical, not grand, but it was deeply satisfying in a quiet, permanent way, the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing justice was done not with shouting or fists, but with patience, truth, and the simple, unstoppable force of consequences. After the meeting, Sophie approached me, her hands twisting nervously. She thanked me for my patience and handed me a signed agreement formalizing the terms we had discussed. The HOA would pay for the new bridge, built to specifications I approved. They would maintain the easement properly without ever attempting to assert authority over it again. And most importantly, they would include a permanent clause in their charter recognizing my property rights. The access road would forever remain private. Construction began within a week. This time, I oversaw every step. The crew they hired was professional, respectful, and made sure to stay well within the boundaries. I chose a simple but sturdy design for the bridge. Nothing fancy or decorative, just strong wood and steel capable of withstanding time and storms. No pastel colors, no frilly lanterns, no useless gazebos. Just a working bridge built with care and respect. Watching it rise from the creek bed was like watching a wound heel, slow and steady. As the bridge neared completion, the tension in the air seemed to lift. Residents who had once viewed me with suspicion now waved as they passed. Some even stopped to chat, thanking me quietly for standing up to the HOA madness. They admitted they had felt trapped for years under Karen's petty rule, but had been too afraid to speak up. When the final nail was hammered and the last board sanded smooth, I held a small gathering for the construction crew and a few neighbors who had supported me. We grilled steaks, told stories, and laughed under the wide open sky. It was not a victory parade, not a celebration meant for show. It was a simple acknowledgement among good people that right had prevailed over wrong. Karen, as far as I knew, rarely left her house after that day. Rumor had it she had put it up for sale, hoping to escape the weight of her own reputation. Few were interested, though. In a town like ours, stories stick harder than chewing gum on a boot heel. No one wanted to buy a house built on bad memories and worse decisions. As for me, I got back to the business of living. The ranch flourished with the coming summer. The fields turned green and thick. The livestock grew strong. The creek, once muddied by the illegal construction, ran clear again. Every time I crossed the new bridge, I was reminded of what had happened. But not with bitterness, with pride. Pride that I had defended what was mine without resorting to their level. Pride that I had outlasted, outsmarted, and ultimately outclassed those who thought they could bully and lie their way into power. And so life settled back into its steady rhythm, stronger and sweeter than before. The road was mine, the bridge was mine, and the respect I had earned was mine. No HOA meeting, no clipboard queen, no amount of bluster could ever take that away. I leaned back in my porch chair one evening, watching the sun sink low behind the hills, and smiled to myself. Some lessons are learned the hard way. Some bridges have to fall before better ones can be built, and sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Summer rolled into the valley like a slow golden tide, and the ranch hummed with life. Every morning began with the smell of fresh hay and the sound of the creek tumbling over smooth rocks beneath the new bridge. There was a peace now, a deeper kind of stillness that settled over the land after a long, hard-fought battle. I no longer checked over my shoulder or wondered what new nonsense the HOA might throw at me. Their power had crumbled, and with it, the constant buzz of tension that used to hang in the air like a gathering storm. The bridge stood strong, assembled not just of access but of everything that had been won back with patience, quiet strategy, and a refusal to be bullied. Life on the ranch fell back into its familiar rhythms. The early morning feedings, the long hours mending fences under the hot sun, the slow evening rides to check the outer pastures. Every task seemed a little lighter now, as if the land itself had sighed in relief. Sometimes I would ride down to the bridge, tie my horse to the post, and sit for a while by the creek, just listening to the water and watching the light dance on the surface. It reminded me that real strength did not come from loud voices or big shows. It came from quiet persistence, from standing your ground when it mattered most. One afternoon, while stacking fresh bales of hay in the barn, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I stepped out into the sunlight, wiping the sweat from my brow, and saw a car pulling up to the gate. It was an older sedan, dusty from the road, and behind the wheel sat a woman I almost did not recognize at first. It was Karen. She sat stiffly, both hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead. For a long moment she did not move. Then with obvious effort she climbed out of the car and approached the gate, a small envelope clutched in her hand. I stayed where I was, leaning casually against the fence, giving her no more attention than was necessary. She stopped a few feet from the gate, cleared her throat, and without meeting my eyes, extended the envelope through the bars. I made no move to take it, simply raising an eyebrow in silent question. Her voice, when it came, was thin and strained. "It is a formal letter," she said, "from me, from the HOA. A final confirmation of the agreement. Your ownership, your rights, everything. Signed and sealed. No more disputes. No more trouble." I studied her for a moment longer, then walked slowly to the gate and took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, thick with official papers. Karen stood there a moment longer, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, as if debating whether to say more. In the end, she simply turned and walked back to her car. Without another word, she drove away slowly, dust rising behind her like a pale ghost against the bright afternoon sky. I watched until she disappeared down the road, feeling no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a sense of finality. Some battles did not end with cheers or parades. Some ended with nothing more than a quiet closing of a door. Weeks passed and summer deepened. The town returned fully to its easy, familiar ways. Without Karen's heavy hand on the HOA, the community began to breathe again. Neighbors started chatting over fences. Kids rode bikes down the streets without fear of ridiculous fines. And even the HOA board meetings became civil affairs focused on actual improvements rather than petty power plays. I stayed out of it for the most part, content to let them find their own way. My life was here on the ranch, where the real work and real peace could be found. Every now and then, I would see a for sale sign go up in the subdivision. Some families chose to move on, looking for a fresh start elsewhere, but most stayed, glad to see change from within. As for Karen, I heard she eventually sold her house at a loss, unable to escape the shadow of her own making. Last I heard, she had moved to a larger town a few counties over, trying to rebuild her life in a place where her name did not carry such heavy baggage. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars winked into view, I saddled up my horse and rode out across the field. The grass whispered against my boots, the air cool and sweet after the day's heat. I crossed the new bridge, pausing in the center to look down at the water below. The moon cast a silver path along the surface, and for a moment, everything was so still, so perfect, it felt almost like a dream. I thought back to how it had all started, one impulsive act of arrogance, one bridge destroyed, and how it had set off a chain of events that revealed so much more than just broken boards and muddy banks. It had revealed the true strength of ownership, the importance of standing firm, and the quiet, enduring power of doing things the right way, even when every instinct screamed for immediate revenge. I clicked my tongue softly and nudged the horse forward, crossing the bridge and heading toward the far pastures. The night stretched out before me, vast and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, and new rewards, and I would face them the same way I had faced Karen and her false authority, with patience, with determination, with a deep understanding that real power was not in titles or clipboards or shouted orders, but in the unshakable bond between a person and the land they love. As I rode into the darkness, the stars spinning slow and steady overhead, I felt a sense of peace so complete it almost brought tears to my eyes. Some battles leave scars, some leave wisdom, and some leave a bridge stronger than any that came before it. A testament to the simple, enduring truth that right will always outlast wrong if you are willing to hold the line.